All right, let's dive in. Today, we're going to crack open a book that completely flips the script on how we think about the history of capitalism. It's Silvia Federici's Caliban and the Witch. And trust me, this is a story you definitely didn't get in your high school history class.
So, let me ask you something. When you think of the great witch hunts in Europe, what comes to mind? Probably mass hysteria, right? Religious fanaticism, medieval superstition. But what if that's not the full picture? What if there was something else going on entirely? Something much more calculated, almost like an economic strategy?
Well, that right there is the explosive idea at the heart of Federici's work. She argues that the witch hunts weren't some historical sideshow. Nope. She says they were absolutely central to building capitalism itself. It was, in her words, a systematic war on women, all to pave the way for a brand new economic order. Okay, so to really get what a huge deal this was, we've got to rewind. We need to look at the world that capitalism basically dismantled. And it was a very different world, one built around community, shared resources, and, believe it or not, a whole lot of resistance to the folks in charge. Yeah, you can pretty much throw out that image you have of the totally helpless, downtrodden medieval serf. I mean, life was tough, for sure, no doubt about it. But peasants had something incredibly important: the commons. These were shared lands, woods, fields, lakes, that gave them a way to survive, a degree of independence. This created really strong communities and a culture that was always pushing back. And, interestingly, it was a world where women actually had a surprising amount of social power. And you can just feel that revolutionary spirit in this quote from John Ball, a leader of a huge peasant uprising. "We are made in the image of God, but we are treated like beasts." I mean, wow. These were not people who were just quietly accepting their lot in life. They were demanding an end to the whole feudal system, pushing for a radical new kind of equality.
So how do you think the ruling class reacted to all this rebellion? Well, they launched a pretty brutal counterattack. They started this campaign of what's called expropriation, which is a fancy word for violently taking away the peasants' land and resources. The goal? To create a whole new class of people who had nothing left to sell but their ability to work. And just like that, you get the birth of the working class, the proletariat.
You know, it's kind of ironic. The Black Death, this horrible plague that wiped out a third of Europe, actually ended up giving the peasants more power. Suddenly, there weren't enough workers to go around, so they could demand better pay and conditions. This led to massive revolts all over the continent. But the ruling class had an answer, and it was called the enclosures. They basically started privatizing all that common land, putting up fences and kicking millions of people off the land their families had lived on for generations. So what happens when millions of people are forced off their land? They flood into the cities, all looking for work at the same time. And you can guess the result. It created this huge surplus of labor, and the economic consequences were just devastating. As you can see here, wages completely collapsed. We're talking about workers losing 2/3 of their purchasing power in just a few decades. It was a kind of poverty that stuck around for centuries.
But here's where Federici's argument gets really interesting. She says that taking the land was only half the battle. To really get capitalism off the ground, you also had to control and subjugate women, especially their bodies and their ability to reproduce. This is the dark secret behind what economists call primitive accumulation. And this, right here, is where the witch hunts come roaring onto the stage.
And the scale of this, it's just staggering. We're talking about a wave of terror that swept across Europe for 300 years. Hundreds of thousands of people, most of them women, were persecuted, tortured, and executed. This wasn't just some random burst of hysteria. Federici argues it was a calculated, sustained campaign.
So, who were these so-called witches? Were they really devil worshippers casting spells? Well, no. They were often the most respected women in their communities. They were the healers, the midwives, the ones who held all the traditional knowledge. But in this new capitalist system, that kind of power was seen as a threat. So their healing became demonic magic. Their knowledge of contraception was criminalized. Their social authority had to be destroyed.
And make no mistake, this was not some spontaneous mob action. It was a well-oiled bureaucratic machine. The state actually encouraged people to anonymously report their neighbors, which just shattered community trust. Torture became a standard procedure, not just to get a confession, but, and this is key, to get the names of other witches, creating a terrifying chain reaction. Oh, and every time someone was convicted, the church and state seized all their property. The witch hunt became a very profitable business.
Now,
This whole system of demonization and dispossession wasn't just happening in Europe. Federici shows how it became a global blueprint. The very same tactics were being used on a massive scale as European powers started their colonial expansion around the world.
To help us see this connection, Federici points us to a famous character, Shakespeare's Caliban from The Tempest. In her analysis, Caliban represents the colonized people of the Americas. He's the counterpart to the European witch. Both were systematically stripped of their humanity and painted as demonic savages, all to justify exploiting them.
And it's wild. Shakespeare literally makes the connection for us in the play. The colonizer, Prospero, says Caliban is a misshapen knave precisely because his mother was a powerful witch. The link couldn't be clearer. The rebellious woman in Europe and the colonized person in the Americas were seen as two sides of the same threat, both standing in the way of this new world order.
And this branding, this demonization, it wasn't just about simple prejudice. It was a license to kill. It was a practical tool for conquest. By calling indigenous people cannibals, devil worshippers, and so on, the colonizers gave themselves the perfect moral justification for slavery, for theft, for genocide. Suddenly, the brutal hunt for golden resources was reframed as a holy mission.
Okay, so after all this, you might be thinking, why does this history from hundreds of years ago even matter today? Well, according to Federici, it matters because the ghosts of the witch hunts and the colonies are still with us. This isn't just about the past. It's about understanding the very ground our modern world is built on. You know, the story we usually get about capitalism is one of peaceful progress, innovation, and ingenuity. But Federici's work just shatters that myth. She reveals a much, much darker origin story. She shows us that the initial pile of wealth that got capitalism started, what Karl Marx called primitive accumulation, wasn't earned. It was stolen. Stolen through centuries of violence, through seizing common lands, plundering colonies, and, crucially, through the brutal control of women's bodies.
And here's maybe the most provocative part of her argument. Federici says this process of taking and controlling never actually stopped. She draws a straight line from the conquistadors of the 16th century to the big international financial institutions of today. She argues that it's the same logic at play, continuing to impoverish communities around the globe, just in a different form.
So that leaves us with a pretty big question to think about, right? After digging into this hidden history, how does it change the way we see the world around us? Can we really look at the inequality and the struggles happening today in the same way, knowing where it all might have started?